People usually begin this mystery in the wrong century. They begin with crusaders, secret orders, dictators, and rumors whispered under ruined stones. But the real case does not begin with men digging in the dark. It begins with an inventory. When Babylon destroyed Jerusalem and stripped the temple of its treasures, the conquerors recorded what they took with cold imperial precision: bowls, lampstands, sacred vessels, bronze pillars, gold, silver, even the objects most people would have considered ordinary. The empire wrote the ruin down line by line. And yet when we reach the place where the most feared object in Israel should have appeared, the record goes quiet. The Ark is not there. That silence is where the case begins. This matters more than the legends that came later. The first myth to clear out of the room is the idea that the mystery of the Ark begins with the Templars, or with modern treasure hunters, or with the fever dreams of the 20th century. It does not. Those are later echoes. The first hard clue is much older and much stranger. A conquering empire that had every reason to display the defeat of Judah did not leave us a triumphant line saying that it seized the Ark. It left a gap, and gaps in a real investigation are not empty. They are shaped spaces. They tell you something should be there and is not. Think about the psychology of empire for a moment. Conquerors do not merely steal wealth, they advertise victory. They parade the gods of defeated peoples. They display sacred objects as proof that the old order has been crushed. If the Ark had been carried away as a prize, we would expect someone to boast about it. If it had been broken apart for its gold, we would expect the gold to be counted. The temple lists are detailed enough to mention far smaller objects. That is what makes the silence so difficult to dismiss. It is not casual forgetfulness. It is a missing center of gravity. That missing line changes the tone of the whole story. If the Ark had been carried to Babylon as a trophy, we would expect it among the spoils. If it had been melted down, we would expect a record of the metal. If it had remained in the inner sanctuary until the final breach, we would expect some trace of shock, triumph, or desecration attached to the event. Instead, the file gives us a harder possibility. By the time the Babylonians reach the holiest room, the object everyone now wants to find may already have been gone.
That is why the noise around this mystery can be so misleading. The world loves a loud trail. Knights tunneling beneath the Temple Mount, governments hiding scans, monks guarding sealed chapels. All of that may matter later. But if we rush there too fast, we commit the oldest error in every bad investigation. We chase the most cinematic lead and ignore the first clean fact. The clean fact is this: Jerusalem fell. The temple was stripped. The scribes recorded the treasure. The Ark is absent. Not rumored, not disguised. Absent. And that absence creates our first reconstruction. Somewhere between the sacred chamber where the Ark once stood and the Babylonian moment of seizure, the chain breaks. Perhaps priests removed it during the long pressure before the city collapsed. Perhaps it was hidden in panic, under orders in tunnels, chambers, or a route known only to a small circle. Perhaps it had already been taken elsewhere long before the final assault, leaving later generations to build legends around a disappearance they no longer understood. What we cannot honestly say, at least not yet, is that we know where it went. The file does not give us that luxury. It gives us something better and more dangerous: a disappearance with motive, pressure, and silence. So here is the first verdict. The strongest starting point in the Ark mystery is not a legend, not a secret order, and not a modern conspiracy. It is a missing object in a conquered temple and a missing line in an imperial record. That does not prove the Ark survived, but it does prove the case did not end in the obvious way. And now the file turns sharper, because if this object vanished before Babylon could catalog it, then we have to ask why it inspired such urgency in the first place. Why was it surrounded by rules no ordinary treasure ever needed? Why did the texts describe it not simply as sacred, but as something people approached with dread? Before we follow the roots of disappearance, we have to examine the object itself. Because the fear did not begin when the ark was lost. The fear was built into the way it was handled from the very beginning.
Most people imagine the Ark of the Covenant as a treasure chest. That is already the wrong mental picture. The text does not describe a box made to impress the eye or enrich a king. It describes an object built under instruction, measured with unusual precision, handled under strict rules, and placed at the center of a system where one mistake could not be treated lightly. In other words, before the ark became a mystery of disappearance, it was already a mystery of design. The case file now takes us back to Sinai, not to ask where the ark went, but what kind of object it was from the very beginning. According to Exodus, the ark was made from acacia wood, one of the hardest and most durable woods available in that region. It was overlaid with pure gold on the inside and on the outside. That detail matters. The text could have said decorated with gold. It does not. It gives a structure. Wood within gold, gold without. Then a molded crown of gold along the top. Then the cover, the mercy seat, and above it, 2 cherubim facing one another, with their wings stretched over the place where the divine presence would be associated with the ark. This is not described like ordinary furniture. It is described like a sacred center built with deliberate layers, boundaries, and surfaces. And then the file gives us the detail that matters most. Not the beauty, not the symbolism, the transport protocol. 4 gold rings are fixed to the sides. Poles of acacia wood overlaid with gold are passed through those rings, and the poles are not to be removed. Not when the ark is moving, not when it is resting, not even when it stands in the holiest place. The poles remain ready, permanent.
That is a strange instruction if this is only about ceremony, but it becomes much less strange if the point is simple. Do not touch the object itself. This is where the first myth has to be removed. The ark was not treated like royal treasure. Royal treasure is carried, counted, displayed, guarded, and admired. The ark is treated more like a boundary. Approach is controlled. Contact is restricted. Handling is delegated only to specific men under specific conditions. The text does not invite casual reverence. It imposes managed distance. That does not prove a modern scientific theory by itself, but it does prove something many retellings miss. The fear around the ark did not begin with later legends. It was built into the original instructions. Even the high priest does not stroll into the inner chamber whenever he likes. The setting is silence, incense, restraint, sequence. Everything about the scene communicates that this is not an object for ordinary proximity. And that leads to the next red herring. The gold can distract us. Gold makes modern readers think first of wealth. But in this file, gold is not just wealth. Gold is surface. Gold is covering. Gold is part of a pattern that the text repeats with almost uncomfortable care. It is as if the narrative wants us to notice not only what the ark meant, but how it was made and how it was approached. So here's the chapter's first verdict. Whatever else the ark was, it was never presented as a simple religious symbol or an ordinary sacred container. The instructions surrounding it are too exact, the handling rules too rigid, and the boundary around it too severe. Before anyone died near it, the warning had already been written into the design. And that is what turns the next chapter from drama into evidence. Because once an object is introduced with this kind of protocol, the later stories of sudden death no longer sound like random acts dropped into the record. They sound like violations of an already established rule. The ark first appears not only as holy, but as something that demanded distance. In the next file, we examined what happened when that distance was broken. Once the design is on the table, the next question becomes unavoidable. Did those warnings remain theoretical, or did anyone ever cross the line and pay for it? The file answers with 3 scenes, and they are usually told as isolated shocks. But read them side by side, and a pattern begins to emerge. Different settings, different people, different motives, yet each case circles the same boundary. Someone comes too near, handles what was not to be handled, or approaches the holy place in a way the text has already marked as forbidden. The first scene is the most human. The ark is being transported, the animals stumble, and a man named Uzzah reaches out to steady it. There is no malice in the gesture, no act of rebellion, no attempt to desecrate what is sacred. He does what almost any human being would do when something precious seems about to fall. And that is exactly why the story lands so hard. His intention is good, his action is fatal. The text does not linger on struggle or decline. It gives something colder than that, contact and then death. In a single instant, the case teaches its first brutal lesson. Around the ark, sincerity is not the same thing as safety. Good motives do not erase a broken boundary. The second scene widens the circle. The ark returns from Philistine territory, and the people of Beth Shemesh celebrate it. The danger appears over. The sacred object is back among its own people. Relief turns to curiosity, and curiosity turns to intrusion. The ark is looked into. The line is crossed not by rescue, but by familiarity. The very people who should have known reverence mistake proximity for permission, and the result is collective devastation. The numbers in the tradition are debated, and that matters because this is where careful reading has to stay honest. But the size of the number is not the heart of the clue. The clue is that the moment the boundary is violated, death follows on a scale larger than one impulsive hand.
This is no longer one man reaching where he should not. It is a public breach, and the file records it as a public catastrophe. Then comes the third scene, and it is different again. Nadab and Abihu are not outsiders. They are priests. They are trained men, sons of Aaron, people formed inside the system itself. If anyone should know the rules of sacred approach, it is them. Yet they bring unauthorized fire before the Lord, and the judgment comes at once. The language is striking because the bodies are carried out, but the clothing remains. The image is not of chaos, but of penetration, not a blaze spreading through the room, but something passing through the men themselves. This is where many retellings become lazy. They use these stories only to say, "Be afraid." But fear alone is not the pattern. The pattern is precision. Touch what was forbidden to touch. Open what was forbidden to open. Approach in a manner the text had already ruled out. 3 scenes, 3 violations of boundary, 3 deaths that the narrative refuses to treat as random. That gives us the chapter's myth to break. The myth is that these are merely scattered ancient horror stories, dramatic but disconnected. They are not disconnected. The file presents them like repeat incidents around the same controlled object. That does not force a single explanation on the listener. One faithful reading is that these deaths are direct acts of divine judgment. Another working theory is that the people were dealing with a danger they obeyed more than they understood. But either way, the text keeps pushing us back to the same conclusion. The protocol mattered because the danger was real. And this is where we have to resist the next false lead. It is tempting to leap too quickly from sacred judgment to modern engineering and declare the case solved. That would be premature. The stories do not hand us a laboratory report. They hand us symptoms, sequence, and pattern. Instant death on contact, catastrophe after exposure, fatal consequence after improper approach. The file is not yet telling us what mechanism stood behind those events. It is telling us that the warnings were not symbolic decoration. They were tied to outcomes. So here's the verdict for this chapter. The stories of death around the ark are not theatrical add-ons to make the object feel mysterious. They function as evidence that the boundary written into the design was enforced in reality, whether by direct judgment, by hidden danger, or by a combination the ancient witnesses themselves could not have separated. And that is why the next chapter matters so much. Because once a pattern like this is established, the modern mind begins asking the question the ancient text never phrases in technical language. If these deaths followed a repeatable pattern, what kind of object were these people actually standing near?
Once a pattern of warning and death is established, the modern mind does what it always does. It begins to test the pattern against mechanism. Not because faith has failed, but because description invites analysis. And this is where the file enters its most dangerous room. The text never says the ark was a machine. It never gives a lecture on voltage, charge, or conductivity. That myth has to be removed before anything else. But the text does do something harder to ignore. It describes an object with conductive surfaces and insulating core, repeated emphasis on exact construction, and strict rules against direct contact. For centuries, that was simply read as ritual precision. Then one engineer asked whether ritual precision and physical danger might have overlapped. In the early 20th century, a French electrical engineer sat down with the Exodus description and read it the way an engineer reads a diagram. Wood at the center, gold on the inside, gold on the outside, two conductive layers separated by a non-conductive material. In modern terms, that is the basic architecture of a capacitor. Not proof, not a solved case, but enough to make the room suddenly quieter. The engineer ran the thought experiment further. If the dimensions are taken seriously, if the wood acts as the insulating barrier, if the gold layers are continuous enough, then the ark is no longer just symbolically interesting, it becomes physically suggestive. Its capacity would not be enormous by modern industrial standards. No one is talking about a power station in the wilderness. But the hypothesis does not need absurd scale to become unsettling. It only needs one point to hold: that under the right conditions, such an object could store charge and release it catastrophically when a human body completed the path. That is why this theory attracts so much attention. It offers a bridge between two worlds that are usually kept apart. On one side, the biblical language of holy danger. On the other, the engineering language of stored potential, discharge, and fatal contact. And it gives the deaths in the previous chapter a pattern modern listeners instantly recognize: touch, shock, collapse, exposure, consequence. But this is exactly where a careful investigation has to slow down, because a compelling model is not the same thing as a proven reconstruction. The capacitor model remains the most disciplined version of the engineering reading, because it grows directly out of the structure already described. It does not require secret civilizations, lost alien knowledge, or mystical chemicals bubbling in the dark. It requires only this much: that a sacred object may also have had physical properties its keepers respected long before they could describe them in modern language. One fateful reading still says the deaths were direct acts of divine judgment. Full stop. A working theory says divine instruction may also have protected the people from a danger built into the object itself. Those two readings do not have to be enemies. Ancient witnesses were not writing laboratory notes. They were telling the truth as they understood it with the language they had. So here is the verdict for this chapter. The strongest rational theory is not that the case has been solved, but that the ark's design is unusual enough to justify serious engineering curiosity. The theory earns a place in the file because it explains why construction, handling, and consequence line up so tightly, but it does not earn the right to become dogma. We are dealing with a disciplined possibility, not a final answer. And that distinction matters, because if the ark was not only sacred but dangerous in ways people half understood and fully feared, then its disappearance starts to look less like accidental loss and more like deliberate removal. In the next chapter, we follow the broken chain from the Holy of Holies to the moment history goes silent.
Once the ark becomes thinkable as a real and dangerous object, its disappearance stops looking accidental. That is where the case changes shape. We are no longer asking what the ark was. We are asking when the chain of custody broke and who had both the motive and the opportunity to make it vanish before Babylon could turn it into a trophy. The file offers 3 serious routes, and none of them gives us the comfort of certainty. The first is the harshest. Perhaps the ark did not survive at all. Perhaps the Babylonians found it, stripped the gold, burned the wood, and reduced the most feared object in Israel to melted metal and smoke. It is a brutally simple theory, and that is exactly why some investigators prefer it. History is full of sacred things meeting ordinary destruction. But this theory carries a problem from the very start. Empires record valuable plunder. They count metal. They display conquered holiness as propaganda. If the Ark had been broken down, we would expect the gold to appear somewhere in the accounting. Instead, the central object vanishes precisely where the inventory is most detailed. That does not prove survival, but it does make straightforward destruction feel too neat. The second route is far more dangerous because it fits the silence better. Jerusalem did not fall in an instant. Pressure built, siege tightened, priests would have known what was coming. One faithful reading of the silence is that the Ark was removed before the final breach, carried out under order and hidden where only a very small circle could recover it. This is where the Temple Mount enters the file, not as a fantasy map, but as the most logical first hiding place. Later Jewish tradition speaks of sacred objects concealed in chambers beneath the sanctuary. Whether those texts preserve memory or only longing is part of the question, but the logic itself is hard to dismiss. If the holiest object in the nation had to disappear quickly, the fastest route was not across continents, it was downward, into stone, into chambers already known to the priesthood.
That theory gains strength from another uncomfortable fact. The area beneath the Temple Mount remains one of the most sensitive pieces of ground on Earth. Archaeology there is never just archaeology. Every trench threatens a theological crisis, a political explosion, or both at once. That means absence of access is not proof. It is simply one reason the question remains alive. And that distinction matters. A sealed place is not the same thing as a solved case. Still, the file does not stop in Jerusalem. It opens a third route, older in claim and farther in distance: Ethiopia. According to the Ethiopian tradition preserved in the Kebra Nagast, the Ark left Jerusalem long before Babylon arrived. In that telling, it was carried to Aksum in the days associated with Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, and it has remained there ever since. On first hearing, the story sounds too complete, almost too ready, as if legend has tied a ribbon around the mystery. But then, the details begin to bother you. In Aksum there is indeed a guarded chapel. Access is indeed restricted. One guardian is indeed said to spend his life beside what the Ethiopian church identifies as the Ark. That does not prove the claim, but it keeps the claim from evaporating. This is where a bad investigation gets intoxicated by drama. Forbidden chapel, lifelong guardian, repeated refusals, vague warnings of catastrophe. It is easy to treat all of that as final confirmation. It is not. Secrecy can protect truth, but it can also protect tradition. Reverence can surround an authentic relic or a powerful memory or a symbol that has become too sacred to test. We have to let the evidence breathe without dressing it in costume. So here is the verdict for this chapter. The destruction theory is possible, but weaker than it first appears, because the silence of the records cuts against it. The Jerusalem hiding theory is the strongest fit for the broken chain of evidence, because it explains both the missing inventory and the centuries of obsession with the Temple Mount. The Ethiopian claim remains the most enduring living tradition, serious enough to stay in the file, but not clear enough to close it. And the case is still not finished, because if Jerusalem gives us the strongest missing link, there is still one later trail that refuses to die. It does not begin with priests or monks. It begins with knights digging under a ruined holy mountain and then carrying a secret back across the sea.
Every long investigation has one trail that arrives late, looks dramatic, and tempts everyone to declare the case solved too quickly. In the Ark file, that trail leads to Scotland. Not because Scotland is the earliest clue, it is not. Not because Rosslyn gives us the strongest evidence, it does not. But because the Templar trail does something the earlier traditions do not. It links a missing relic to a sudden rise in power, a culture of secrecy, and a place where stone itself seems to whisper that something was carried there and hidden on purpose. The trail begins where it should begin, under the ruins of the Temple Mount. 9 knights arrive in Jerusalem and receive quarters on the ground associated with the old temple. Their public mission is protection. Their private activity looks very different. They dig, not for days, but for years. That is the first reason that Templar theory refuses to die.
Men do not spend that kind of time tunneling beneath the holiest ruin in the city unless they believe something specific lies below. Then comes the second reason. When the order returns to Europe, poverty gives way to astonishing reach: wealth, influence, banking, privilege. It is possible, of course, that this rise can be explained by patronage, papal favor, and disciplined organization. Serious history does not need magic to explain ambition, but the timing still needles the imagination. They go down poor, they come back powerful. That gap is where legend begins to breed, and legend in this case eventually points north. After the suppression of the order, after arrests, torture, and the collapse of Templar power in France, one story insists that part of the hidden inheritance escaped by sea and found refuge in Scotland. There, generations later, Rosslyn Chapel appears like a coded afterimage of an older memory. Solomon imagery, unusual symbols, a building that does not feel quite content to be only what it officially claims to be.
This is where a careless investigation loses its balance. Symbolism is not proof. Echo is not identity. A chapel can imitate the temple without housing the ark. A family can guard a basement without guarding the holiest relic in biblical history. Those distinctions matter. Without them, we stop investigating and start daydreaming in stone. And yet, the Rosslyn Trail refuses to evaporate. Sealed chambers beneath the chapel, repeated refusals to open them, reports of scans suggesting a large rectangular metallic object, a family tradition that insists what lies below must remain below. None of that closes the case, but none of it lets the case die either. It leaves Rosslyn where the best unresolved leads belong, not at the center of the file, but still inside it. What matters most is not whether the Templars make the mystery more romantic. What matters is whether they make the chain of custody more believable. And here the answer is mixed. They can explain transfer, they can explain concealment, they can explain why a relic, if found, would vanish again behind oath and stone. What they cannot yet explain is verification. No opened chamber, no examined object, no documented continuity strong enough to move Rosslyn from compelling late trail to established conclusion. By the end of the file, one sober conclusion remains. The ark may have been destroyed. It may be hidden beneath Jerusalem. It may stand behind living ritual in Ethiopia. Or it may have passed through hands that decided secrecy was safer than revelation. But the strongest clue is still the earliest one, the silence in the Babylonian record. Everything after that is reconstruction, some of it disciplined, some of it swollen by fear and longing. And that is why the case remains open. Not because mystery is more enjoyable than truth, but because the available truths refuse to lock together cleanly. The ark survives in history as a missing center, an object too dangerous, too sacred, or too politically explosive to be brought into daylight. Perhaps that is why so many late traditions sound less like triumph and more like warning. If the object was ever found, the people who found it may have decided that hiding it was not cowardice, but wisdom. And so the final line of the case is not certainty, but a boundary. We have enough evidence to know this mystery is not trivial. We do not have enough evidence to pretend it is solved. Somewhere between faith, fear, memory, and silence, the trail stops. And maybe that is the last lesson the ark leaves behind. Some objects are not only lost, they are kept from us.